The coronavirus outbreak recently has caused a few phone calls to come to me, and I've seen a lot of questions online about force majeure and how it may apply to certain contracts. So I wanted to take a moment and explain that concept a little bit and see if it may help you in your situation. First, let's look at what force majeure is. Force majeure defines an area of unforeseeable events that might excuse non-performance within a contract period. The event must have been beyond the party's control and without his fault or negligence. And it's the non-performing party who has the burden of proof to show that they did not perform the contract because of the force majeure event. So let's take a look at a case here where William Perlman was looking to drill, prospect, explore, and operate some oil and gas on some land out in Montana and Wyoming. Well, he entered into a contract with Pioneer Limited Partnership and agreeing to pay them rent. Well, there was a force majeure clause that they did put into the contract. It said that the lease shall not be terminated if the compliance is prevented or hindered by an act of God, inability to obtain governmental permits or approvals, and then some other things that go along with it. And it also said that the lessee, or Perlman, shall use all reasonable efforts to remove such force majeure. Well, the state of Wyoming was looking at this operation and they had their concerns and were looking at permits and they wanted to know more about what Perlman was doing. Well, those studies to do so were going to cost about $50,000 to $200,000 per well that Perlman was drilling. Well, when Perlman walked out of that meeting, he was like, I'm not paying it. I can't do this. I can't proceed with looking at for these permits, and Montana is likely to do the same thing to me. So he invoked a force majeure clause of the contract, and there apparently was some dispute about it, so they filed a suit for a declaratory judgment, basically saying, hey, court, you decide this for us before we really have an issue. Well, the court came down and said that there was no actual hindrance from the regulators, and Perlman made no effort whatsoever to obtain the permits. And even though he had a duty to remove that force majeure event. In Eddington versus Creek Oil Company, it was a 1984 case, they said that force majeure is not an escape for interruptions that could be prevented by the exercise of prudence, diligence, care, and use of reasonable appliances. And I think that's a very important phrase there, the use of reasonable appliances, especially in today's world of the coronavirus. A force majeure clause is not intended at all to buffer a party against the normal risk of a contract. So one thing that comes up in times like this are supply, demand, and pricing. So in a 1989 10th Circuit Court of Appeals case, the court says neither a decline in demand nor an ability to sell at or above the contract price constitutes a force majeure event. See, a lot of people claim force majeure because they're going to lose money on it. That's not what a force majeure event means. It means that the parties are going to take that risk, but a force majeure is going to look at, can you perform it reasonably with reasonable appliances? So, is all lost if I can't argue force majeure? The answer is no. There's a couple of things that you can look at to excuse your performance of a contract. We look at impracticability, impossibility, and frustration of purpose. Now, these get very complicated, and depending on the situation, it might be where you need to look at your specific case and with your contract. Many times when people call me up and say, hey, what is this about? I say, what does the contract say? I've answered that. I've answered several questions this week just like that. I said, what does the contract say? And that's really what you look into. And the courts are going to look at what did the parties intend. We can go back to the coronation of King Edward VII. Now, that's taking us back to the early 1900s. And there was a coronation that was going to happen with King Edward VII and Queen Alexandra. It was going to be in 1902, but it was postponed because the king had surgery for an abdominal abscess. Well, C.S. Henry, he was a guy who rented a flat from Paul Krell. And the purpose for renting the flat was because it was a wonderful view for the coronation procession. So C.S. Henry agreed to pay the rent, and he paid a deposit. Well, the coronation ended up not taking place as planned because of the king's surgery. And Henry, the guy who was renting the flat, refused to pay the remaining portion of the rent. Well, the owner of the flat sued Henry to get the remaining portion. The court looked into this and asked three main questions. One was, what was the foundation of the contract? Was the performance of the contract prevented? And was the event which prevented the performance of the contract of such a character that it cannot reasonably be said to have been in the contemplation of the parties at the date of the contract? If all three of those questions are answered affirmatively, both parties are discharged from further performance of the contract. So the ultimate test here is whether the event which causes the impossibility was or might have been anticipated and guarded against. There's a doctrine of supervening frustration that was stated in a Restatement Second of Contracts, section 265. The restatement is very important. It says where, after a contract is made, a party's principal purpose is substantially frustrated without his fault by the occurrence of an event, the non-occurrence of which was a basic assumption on which the contract was made, his remaining duties to render performance are discharged, unless the language or the circumstances indicate the contrary. So, the question you may be asking, which I think is a very big question, is what about the deposit that C.S. Henry paid to Krell when he initially made the contract to rent his flat? Well, when Krell sued Henry, Henry countersued, sued Krell back for that deposit to be returned. For whatever reason, Henry ended up dropping that claim. Don't know why, but it was not settled in this particular case. But we can look at the other coronation cases that centered around the same coronation that was postponed. There were many plaintiffs who did seek the restitution of the down payment, and they were denied. Basically, the court said the gains and losses were left where they lay at the time of the frustration. I'll tell you that the law appears to be unsettled when it comes to this, and there could be some litigation over whether or not to get that deposit back, and it really heavily weighs on what are the circumstances, what does the contract say in these situations. One of the claims that come to mind is maybe a case for unjust enrichment. So anyway, I hope that this information about force majeure, impossibility, impracticability, frustration of purpose, I hope all of this is at least a little bit helpful to you and may be able to help answer some of the questions that you have about your own contracts that you may be looking at for answers. If it is, I'd appreciate it if you contribute to me at Venmo at SK McNeil, that's with 2 L's. I've got a QR code here on the screen that you can use and easily contribute. I'd greatly appreciate it. You don't have to, obviously, but certainly would appreciate if this information is the least bit helpful to you. Thank you very much.